Hello and welcome to this video where we begin to look at using variables in our VBA code. Now when we use Excel in its typical spreadsheet environment, we are using cells to store our data, whether it be currency, date, text, percentage. Now when we write macros and using VBA to write procedure, we use variables to store our information. So unless we are looking at writing information to a cell to make it visible to the user, data should be stored in variables, as they ensure that your code runs much faster than storing data in cells, so you don't have to write to the cell and read the cell. A variable is not a physical container like a cell is. It's stored in memory. It's much faster to access. It's not something that you can see. And there are also different data types. So it provides an area of validation for the data that it stores as well. What I'm going to use as an example here is we're going to look at filling in this invoice. Or we're not going to fill it in, it's already filled in. But we want to store information about this invoice on this invoice tracker sheet. We want this as a new entry at the bottom, similar to some of the stuff we've been doing so far, but the difference here is that I'm going to store the invoice date, invoice, client, and if I scroll down a bit, total, to a variable. Each will have its own variable before we then write it to the sheet. So I want to use as an example of using 4 different types of data as well in a variable. So let's get stuck straight in. I'm going to switch to the Visual Basic editor and insert a new module and create a new procedure which I'll call using variables. And the first thing we should do is declare our variables. Now, it's not mandatory to declare your variables, but it's extremely good practice. It is highly recommended. It makes your code much easier to read. It also makes it faster, as it uses less memory. Let's maximize that. And it also, what's the other thing? It provides an area of validation. So we'll get type mismatch errors, as we're going to specify that one stores a number and one stores text, etc. Just like we can use validation and formatting on a worksheet normally. Now, variables should always be declared as the first thing in a procedure. That is where people expect them to be found. And to declare them, we use the word dim, which stands for dimension, which is not really that important to know, but just in case you felt there was an insult, it is for dimension. Then we follow it with the name of the variable, and for this first one, it's going to be the date of the invoice, so I'm going to call it invoice date. You can't use spaces or start with numbers in variable names, the same rules as using procedure names or macro names. And then I'm going to put the word as to specify a data type for this variable. And probably no surprise that I'm going to specify this as a date. Now, there are many different data types with variables. We're going to look at 4 different types here, and I've provided a sheet for download or just for viewing in this lesson, so you can have a look at that, and it lists, I think, about 15 of the main types of variable which we're going to see throughout this course. We're going to use Boolean variables and long and object and these different types. But just like there are many types of formatting on the sheet, there are many types of variable. Okay, now the second variable, so I'll use dim to declare, is going to be for the ID. So I'm going to have invoice ID, and that I'm going to store as the data type of long, which can only handle integers, negative and positive integers, of quite a large value. That sheet will also mention data types of byte and integer, which are also used to store numbers, but of less values. And I don't know how many IDs over time we will use, so I'm using a large number to be sure that I don't get an overload error and that it's capable of handling whatever number goes in there. Byte, for example, handles as much as 0 to 255, which is only good for small numbers like people's ages, number of spreadsheets within a book, and integer, which goes as far as I think it's 32,766, I believe. So once again, quite a small number, I mean, much bigger than byte, but considering there's over 1 million rows in a spreadsheet, etc., 32,000 is not that big a number. Okay, next up we're going to have the name of the client, and that is going to be storing text. So the data type is string. We use data type called string to store text. And finally, we're going to have one to store the invoice total. So we'll call it invoice total, and that is going to be the data type of currency. So I'm taking this opportunity to store 4 different types of data. Now once again, I could declare a variable without the data type. It's not necessary. It's quite happy for me to do that. And although the name kind of gives this one away with dates, though it is recommended both to make your code readable, if it will know what's going on, but also to make it faster. If you do not specify a data type, it uses the data type called variant. Variant is like a chameleon data type. It can handle any type of data in any given situation, so it's extremely useful at times, but I believe it's 16 bytes of data at a minimum, whereas things like long handle 4 bytes. This is all on that sheet. It's something you can reference in VBA help or on that sheet I've provided. But it's a good, what is that, 8, just 4 times, at least 4 times larger, more space it's taking in memory. Okay, so they are our declarations for variables declared. Next up, we're going to initialize the variables. We're going to assign a value to them, and we want to assign the value from that invoice sheet. So if I just pop back to the invoice sheet for a moment, we can see that the date is in cell D3, number on D4, client D5, and total D27 on a sheet called invoice. Now, probably won't bother putting a button in because we've done that on this course, but I'm imagining that I would put a button around here or something on this invoice, so I know somebody's on the sheet when they run this, so I don't need to reference the invoice sheet in the procedure. I'm going to pop back to our editor, and I'm going to put invoice date equals range D3, if I remember rightly, dot value. So I'm assigning the value from D3 to a variable called invoice date. And then I'm going to do the same for the others. So I have invoice ID equals range D4 dot value. Tell you what, let me take a copy of that. In for the next one, client equals, and I'll paste that in, the value of D5, and finally the invoice total equals the value of D27. So I've assigned the 4 values to a variable. Now you might be thinking you could have just written them straight onto the other sheet. You don't need the variable. And you're right, I don't. So this maybe isn't an award-winning example of the use of variables, but it's just to get us into the concept and get us into the practice of doing them. Trust me, there will be some far more awesome examples of the use of variables before the end of this course. And if you're not appreciating their use as yet, you certainly will. They're a fundamental concept of VBA programming. Okay, next step is to get to the position where we want to input these values, which is at the bottom of the invoice tracker sheet. So I'm going to put worksheets, and I'm going to reference the invoice, or I'm going to activate the invoice tracker sheet. .activate, shooting through this. This is stuff we've done on previous lessons. Selecting a sheet, and I'm going to select the next empty cell at the bottom of this list. So I'm going to say range A2 dot end Excel down dot offset 1,0 one row below dot select. So once again, something we've done on a previous course. One line that's going to get us the next empty cell at the bottom of column A, as that is. And now we're going to write them values in. The first one that needs writing is the ID. If I just quickly refresh our memory, this is the invoice tracker sheet. So ID, date, client, amount. Let's pop back to that. Back to our editor. Active cell. Active cell. Dot value equals, and I can put invoice ID. So the value that's in that variable can now be assigned to a cell. And then I'm going to put active cell dot offset 0,1 to move one column to the right. Value equals. Now I want to put invoice date. I'm going to take this opportunity to mention something else. If I hold down Control and press space, that will force this list to appear. So it may help with inputting things like variables. So as I'm typing invoice, I can see my variables now appear in that normal list of properties and methods that we've been seeing so far, and we'll see a lot more of. So it's another way that might speed up the input of your variables. So that was Control and your spacebar to initiate that list. Okay, let me take a copy of this active cell dot offset, and I'll put equals client, and I'll paste it in again to say equals invoice total. And then I'll need to change them offsets to the second column along and the third column along. So now we've written the three variables into the active cell. Now I'm going to put one more thing in. I think I'm going to have a message box that will display the invoice ID to the user. So I'm going to say invoice ID. Let's put a space in there. Now I'm going to concatenate the ID in, which is invoice ID. I referenced a variable that has got the ID stored. So you can see it's much easier to reference the ID rather than having to say sheets, invoice, range, D4.value, which is where it is. It's much shorter code, far easier to reference. Remember, I'm on the invoice tracker sheet at the moment, so I have to reference back to invoice to get to it. Okay, I'm going to then concatenate on another piece of text, to say has been added to the tracker. So a quick little message box, say invoice ID blah has been added to the tracker. Now, one last thing I want to add to this before we play this through is this locals window that I have at the bottom of my screen at the moment. Now, if I close that down, we can bring the locals window in from the view menu. And we'll see some of these other windows by the end of the course. But this is a logical point to talk about locals, as it is used to track your variables. So I choose the locals window, it appears at the bottom of the screen, although you can move it. I love the locals window. I use it an awful lot. As I say, it tracks your variables as you go through your code. So the plan is to restore this window so we can see what's going in behind it, so we can both see the spreadsheet behind, and I can also see the locals window. And I'm going to use the F8 key to step through the procedure. So as soon as it starts, I can see the declaration. Type on the far right, current value in here, so the speech marks for the string there, and the name. And as we step through it, I can immediately see the initial assignment there. So it goes past the invoice date, which I can also see by hovering over the variable name in the code. You can see at the bottom that it has the correct date. We can spot an issue if there was one at that point. Continuing to press F8, I can see each bit of information getting stored in the locals window, allow me to track it to identify problems or understand somebody's procedure. Now this one, we'll see it move to the tracker in the background. I'm in row 5 somewhere by the looks of it, but as soon as I move past that, I'm in that empty cell. And then it's just going to write each variable details. Let's move this out of the way for the next one, into the appropriate cell. Bit of a mix up on formatting there. I've got accounting and currency going on. Something to deal with. Finished with a message box. Invoice ID 114, so using the variable, has been added to the tracker. So that is an introduction look at variables. The importance of declaring your variables, which should happen at the top of a procedure, normally followed by the initializing of the variables, although it can happen at some other point in the procedure, and then looking at writing them to cells and also a message box. The variables can accept data from message boxes, cells, functions, input boxes, user forms, anything we use in VBA, and we will be using it as a way of storing data during a macro so that we can then refer to it and use it. Hello and welcome to this video on the role of option explicit in VBA. Now by default you do not have to declare variables in VBA. So we mentioned in a previous video how important it is and the benefits of them. We're now going to look into this a little bit more, and the fact that by default you do not need to. However, if I was to demonstrate an example here, and within this code I'm going to remove the C from our invoice total here, therefore trying to imitate a typing mistake, and I'm going to use my F8 key to step through the macro. And notice in my locals window, which I still have open at the bottom, that it has created a variable called invoice total. So because our code has come across, our compiler has come across a word which it doesn't recognize as an existing variable or a reserved word in VBA, so it's therefore created a variable by that name, assuming that's what it must be. Now this may seem like good behaviour, I don't know, but this is not good. It makes it very difficult to try and track why your code is not working. And if I just double check that I'm on my invoice sheet, I am, and if I carry on stepping through this code, we will see that it assigns the total to the wrong variable now. So I don't get an error message, it just continues to work but doesn't work correctly. What we sometimes call a logical error. So this can be much more difficult for you to track down and figure out why your code is not working. Especially when we start looking at loops and if statements and these more complex stuff. So it is definitely common practice to declare your variables. And that is what a line called option explicit will force you to do. So if I click my reset button, on the toolbar to come out of break mode here and stop that, and I'll put my C back into invoice total. And above and before any other lines of code in the module, I will type the words option explicit to force you to explicitly declare your variables. So now, I should have left that out. If I just take that C back out of invoice total, and if I F8 through my code, it immediately gives me this error message saying I have a variable not defined, a compile error, and it has highlighted the word in question. So much easier for me to debug that issue now, as that word must have been typed incorrectly. Now with the words option explicit there, seeing the error message of variable not defined is not unusual, and it's so common that you've just made a typo. So you've missed the N out of range and you've put rage, or you missed a D out of end. And normally just stuff like this, and it'll come up variable not defined. So it may not be a variable, just you have mistyped something. And it's far better than it warns you, than it just has a guess at creating a variable in that instance and running with that. Okay, let's stop that debugging and put my C back in, and I've just typed option explicit above and before anything else in this module, and it's sectioned it off for me. Let's have a look at the tools menu and options from that menu, where we can see that there is a checkbox to require variable declaration. Now this checkbox would not work retrospectively, and it would not put option explicit in this module if it was not already there. What it does ensure though is that with that box checked, if I clicked on OK, I went to insert future modules, option explicit would immediately be at the top. So for now and forever, I'll go back to module 1, option explicit will be there. And that is highly recommended that that checkbox becomes checked to ensure tools options, that checkbox there, that option explicit is always there, and you are forced to declare your variables. It is very much good practice. Okay, let's have a look before we come out of here at a couple of other examples of the importance of declaring variables. We spoke about the speed, the ease of reading, that I can see the variables already. I even know what data type they are, and we spoke about this in a previous video. Let's see a couple of more error examples. So what I'm going to do is this invoice ID variable we've got as a data type of long, which handles a huge number, an integer value, negative to positive. Remember on my previous lesson, I have an attachment there, I have a file for you to download or to view within the lesson, which lists the more popular data types. What I'm going to do is change that to byte. Byte being it handles a value between 0 and 255. It's a very small integer. Now the current value on the invoice is 114. So if I was to run that, that should be quite happy with that value. So as it goes through, I can see 114 assigned to that variable as it's the data type of byte. You can see on the end there. Now if I stop that, if I reset that, and on the invoice sheet, I'm going to change that to a number larger than 255. So that if I go back to the editor and I start stepping through my code, I receive a runtime error, number 6 at that point, an overflow error. And if I hit debug, it prompts me to the area. I can see the value has not gone in there. The value is too large for that data type, an overflow error. So without me specifying that as bytes, I would not have seen that or even declaring it. So these are some of the importance, some of the things that are really going to help you out with troubleshooting, reading what's going on and that kind of stuff. I'm going to reset that. It was just a demonstration of an overload runtime error there. I'll change that to long to handle larger values. And for another common error message related to variable declaration is if I go back to the ID and I'm going to type a letter T in front. So maybe an honest mistake. It's 321 here, so it should. Actually, it's two. That would be too much. How's my maths? 211, which should be less than 255. But a letter T in front, indicating that should be text. And I've just made an honest typing mistake. Actually, this is long now, so it should easily be in that anyhow. What am I talking about with them numbers? But if I start to F8 through this, bam, we've got another runtime error. This one caused by the letter T, which means that would be string, that is text. It's trying to assign it to a variable with a long data type, which can only handle whole numbers, negative and positive, type mismatch. So it cannot handle that type of data. And there it prompts me to it. Now, if I didn't have long on the end there, that would be quite happy to handle that, because as I F8 through, I can see my invoice ID has a data type of a variant. So it should be able to handle that value. In goes T211. And I can see the speech marks around it indicating it is stored as a string. It says there, variant currently as a string. So there's some good uses of the variant. And if we were going to use it, I would, type as variant rather than leave it blank, because that makes our code, let's reset that project, makes our code more readable. But, this is stuff that you may come across when you see other people's macros. So it's good to know this stuff, but there is certainly a best practice, and that is certainly to use option explicit, and more importantly than that, to declare your variables with a data type. Hello and welcome to this video on variable scope, where we start to look at the accessibility of your variables across different procedures. So we've got the sub procedure created that we've been using in the last two videos, the last two lessons, where we have sub using variables. And at the moment, the variables that we have declared using the dim keyword at the top of our procedure are only available within this procedure. So only available to statements within this procedure. What we're going to look at doing is I'm going to create a new procedure within this code module, module 1, below this using variables 1. So I'm going to put dim add to invoice tracker. So I've created a new sub procedure called add to invoice tracker, and I'm going to cut and paste the statements that perform the add-in to the invoice tracker. So I'll put the word dim there instead of sub. That have been adding it to the invoice tracker sheet. So I've left the code in using variables that declare the variables and then assign the initial values to them. I've left them there, and I've added the ones that add them to the invoice tracker to this other procedure. Now in the using variables procedure, I will add the line call add to invoice tracker. So that line will run the other procedure, the other macro, or call it from the using variables procedure. So it will declare the variables, assign the values, run the other procedure, which will then add them to the invoice tracker sheet. Now this is good practice to break down a large macro into more manageable chunks. Now this isn't a large macro, but the example, the kind of concept is not a bad idea. It's very popular. It's a very good idea to have these more manageable macros. Now I've got my locals window open at the bottom, and I'm just going to double check what sheet I'm in. I'm in the wrong sheet. I need to be in the invoice sheet, where I have this new invoice. And from the editor, I'm going to use my F8 key to step through. So I'm going to click within the using variables procedure and use F8 to step through. I can immediately see the locals window declare those variables. And as I step through, I can see it assign the values to them. And then it jumps to the add to invoice tracker procedure, and I get this message for variable not defined. And if I drag that to the side, I can see it's complaining about invoice ID. I can see at the bottom in the locals window that I do not have any variables. So they have been reset, they have not carried across, and that is the problem. So I'm going to OK that and reset the procedure out of break mode. And to solve this, I'm going to cut and paste them 4 statements that declare variables below option explicit at the top of this module. So by doing that, notice the editor puts this line below the variables to section them off. I've made those variables available to all procedures within this module. So they're available module wide and not procedure wide as they were previously. So now if I click within the using variables procedure and try stepping through the code, looking down below, if I click this plus sign next to module 1, I can see they're now available module wide. They have module scope. I can see them variables have been declared. As I move through, they are assigned the values, and then it calls the other procedure. And if I expand that module 1 again, I can see they are still available. I can see the assignments are in there. And if I restore this window so I can see behind it, we can see as I F8 through, scroll that down, then it moves to the other sheet and then assigns the values to the extra line and displays the message box. So we have made them variables available to all procedures within this one module at the moment, this code module, module 1, by putting them at the top of the module. Okay, let's reset that module, and what I'm going to do is insert another module to this project. So insert a new module, a module 2, and I'm going to cut and paste the add to invoice tracker procedure to this new module. So now they are different code modules. Now for this to continue to work, in module 1 I will change the dim keyword to the word public, and by making these variables public, they will be available to all to procedures in all macros of this project, which we'll see a demonstration of. It's quite good practice in very large kind of macros to make a module that just holds your procedures, and and call it variables or something, so you know where they are and they kind of have their own module. I've seen that before. It's not a bad idea. But now with these as public, I've got using variables within that module, the others in the other one. Let's look at running this again. I have to make sure I'm in using variables. Start F8ing through. When I expand module 1 now, I can see that they are there and they are assigned the values. Oh, hold on, I'm on the wrong sheet. Let's stop that for a moment. I need to reset my workbook. I can see them values were not correct. Let's go back to invoice. In fact, let's modify the invoice as well. Denim Motors, be 116. Let's change some of this around. Here we go, we've got a new invoice. Let's go back to our code. Okay, let's give that another try. Let's F8 through. If I expand module 1, we can see them in there. This time it should get the right information. There's the date, 116, Denim Motors, and whatever that was, 670. And it's going to call the other procedure. Module 2, let's have a look. No variables. So I expand module 2, it doesn't show any variables. But if I hover over the variable names within the procedure, I can see that they do have those values assigned to them. So as I move through this, and if I restored that to C behind, I can see the values being assigned to the lines and invoice 116 mentioned at the end. So we don't see them in the locals window because it is local. And module 2 doesn't show any variables, but they are available. The public statement ensuring that the variable, like their values are maintained, and we can see that as we kind of hover over the variable names, which is very useful when troubleshooting code and using variables in this manner. So that is variable scope. We can have variables available to a procedure, to a module, or to a project. To make them available to a procedure, we enter them at the top of the procedure. Available to a module, we enter them at the top of the module. Available to a project at the top of the module, but with the keyword of public. Hello and welcome to this lesson where we have a look at object variables. Now these are a special type of variable, these object variables, because as their name implies, they can act as an object. So we can declare variables using data types such as a worksheet, as a workbook, as a chart, as a range. We can then assign sheets or ranges to these variables and have them act as an instance of a range or a book. They will assume all the properties and methods of one, so it can provide us with an easy way of referencing a particular sheet or range, even if we don't know, the address of the range or the name of the sheet ourselves. So as an example of this for now, I'm going to use this invoice tracker macro that we've been working on in this section of the course, and we're going to look at how we could improve it with a couple of object variables. Now we're going to see some amazing examples of these variables later on as the course, as we slowly progress after getting these concepts under a belt into some far more sexy ways of where they can be used. For now though, up where we can declare our variables, I'm going to declare another variable using the same technique that we've used so far, so the keyword of dim, and then I'm going to use the name SHT, and I'm going to specify the data type as a worksheet. So this is an object data type. Now when I press enter, the name worksheet does not go blue like the other data types do. If I'd written the word object, it would have, but I'm being far more specific as I know the type of object I want to use here. I'm going to declare another variable which I'm going to call new entry, and that data type will be as a range. So I've got one object variable that's going to act like a worksheet and another one that's going to act like a range. And what I'd like to do here is, instead of having to reference the invoice tracker worksheet by putting a statement like this and activating it to get onto the sheet, I would initially assign it to the variable SHT, so then whenever I want to reference that sheet, I can simply use the word SHT. Now the new entry range will act as this. So instead of mentioning to go to the bottom of the invoice tracker sheet, I will assign that once to the new entry variable, so then whenever I need to refer to it, I can refer to it as new entry, a meaningful name. What this will also mean for us now is that we don't have to activate and select stuff on the invoice tracker sheet. When somebody clicks the button, from our invoice, it will not need to go to invoice tracker to do it. It can stay on this sheet and just reference the areas by using our object variables. Now, another twist in the towel to try and strengthen the argument for what object variables can do for you is on the invoice tracker sheet, it has been protected. So I can see on the review tab, unprotect sheet is lit up because that sheet is protected. Now, we will not be able to write to it until I have unprotected that sheet, because these cells here are protected. And row 7 will be what I'm going to have to use. So let's go back to invoice and back to our code, and we'll do the assignment. So I've declared two variables in the same way as before. Now we want to assign something to them. And this is where things get a tiny bit different, because we need to use the keyword set. Whenever we assign to an object variable, we have to use the keyword set. Now, this is something different to what we do, as we can see with the variables above. We do not use such a word, we can just assign straight to them. Once the word set is in, it is, as we know, sht equals, and I'm going to put worksheets invoice tracker. I could just copy the line from below and it's in. And I can now remove that because I will not have a need to activate that sheet when this is working. Now let me grab a copy of that while I have that in my mind. And in the line below I will write set new entry equals, and I'll paste that line in and remove it from where it is below. So SHT is the invoice tracker sheet, but an easy name to reference now. New entry is the cell, well, it's the new entry cell. It is the first vacant cell at the bottom of column A on the invoice tracker sheet. Just realising something I've missed out there. It's going to be our SHT to the left of that range. We're not on that sheet before. I need the SHT there. And our first example, I guess, it's very important that we assign that before I do this of the use of these object variables. I would have to write worksheets invoice tracker before that otherwise. Okay. That sheet is protected. We need to unprotect it before I can do this right into the cells. So it's going to be sht.unprotect. So sht is that sheet. I can unprotect it, and below them lines I'm going to protect it again. So it's going to unprotect them, write the lines in, and then protect the sheet again. Now, last thing I believe on here are these active cell lines. I'm not in that cell. Well, I'm probably not in that cell in reality when this happens. So I'm going to change that to new entry. I'm not selecting it anymore. I'm using these object variables. Let's take a copy of new entry and paste that into the other lines. And I believe we are rocking and rolling. Got my message box. Now this is our code with our object variables. Let's restore this window and check out what we've got. So I'm on the invoice sheet at the moment. As I press F8, variables are declared. And I can see SHT and new entry at the bottom with a value of nothing and acting as a worksheet and arrange. Now as you move through and start assigning to these, I can see the assignments are made and I have a plus sign next to them. This shows, if I use SHT as an example, all the different information that variable now has that I could access about it, because it is functioning as a sheet object. Really useful. Protection. Okay, let's move through. Unprotected that sheet. And then we start writing to the cells. Now I can't see this behind because there's no need to activate that sheet anymore. I'm still on invoice. But if I pop back there now, I can see the first two bits of information are in and the sheet is unprotected. Let's move back to our code. Continue through. In it goes. In it goes. Protected. Let's click on that sheet. It has been protected again. Into the message box and it's over. Let's reset that. So that is, performing the same job as what we've been doing, but it's showcasing use of object variables, which we'll see some very strong examples of, especially with regards to looping and when we start getting into our more large scale projects. For now, it's an example of how to use them, how to write them. Remember to use the keyword set when initializing to these objects.